term. That's the right term, but we got to make sure we're using the right version of enforce, because if what we mean by enforce is you didn't follow the law and I'm penalizing you, that's not as complete a picture as we want. That's one end of it. They will enforce. They have agencies that monitor to make sure, like the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. There are rules that you're supposed to follow with regards to emissions. If a company is not, or a state is not following those rules, they'll hand out sanctions, and then that way they'll enforce. But what else do you hear in executive? To execute, which means to carry out, right? To administer. So that's a broader term that has both sides of the equation. When the legislative branch makes a law, on average a law is like 26 pages, but those 26 pages don't cover every contingency, nor are they kind of prepared to see into the future in terms of like, okay, we're trying to apply this thing and we haven't thought of certain contingencies. The executive branch, through its departments, through its agencies, is the one that handles the daily administration of the law, that realizes that, okay, we haven't thought of this particular scenario, let's sit down and come up with a solution to it. And then they also enforce if someone isn't kind of following it, okay? So, long story short, when we're talking public policy, we're not just talking about laws, we're not just talking about the actions of the legislative branch, we're also talking about what the executive branch has done through its departments and agencies on a daily basis in terms of carrying it out. We're also, inferring the courts. The courts, in many ways, in upholding or striking down laws, helps to establish public policy. Okay? So when you hear policy, what we're talking about is the sum total kind of cumulative purpose of government. I think it helps to have an example. One of the major things that we're currently concerned with is, let's say, environmental problems. When you look at everything that the government has done surrounding the environment, that equals public policy. So recycling initiatives, that's part of it. The emission standards and penalties that they might hand out to companies that aren't following those emission standards. They give kind of credits as well. Like, there's these carbon credits that you can, if you are polluting, then you're going to give us some money as a result. You can decide to pollute and pay for it, essentially. We're going to use that money for other things. So, the public awareness campaigns, on and on it goes in terms of like everything that we're doing to studies. We're going to look at authorizing kind of universities and research institutes through public funding, through grants, to do some studies to give us some information. It's the sum total of those steps that are in response to environmental concerns that make up the policy. It may be easier to think about the obesity crisis. That's another crisis that we look at. What is the sum total of what we've done with, to combat, especially like adolescent obesity? You can look at like school lunch programs and the Jump Up and Go programs and other public awareness programs. And what are we doing? What's the Department of Agriculture doing with regards to companies and the ingredients that they have? All right. So when we're talking about government, what you've got to understand is there is a superficial understanding of a definition and then a larger understanding of a definition. Your superficial understanding of government, starts with the idea of, okay, there's individuals working in various institutions that make laws. We're going to blow that up, because eventually, as the year goes on, your understanding of people gets much more sophisticated. It goes much more beyond the president. Your understanding of institutions gets much more sophisticated. It goes beyond the three branches. Your understanding of, what the goal of government is, to pass laws, to create order and security and stability, gets much more sophisticated, because you realize there's an undercurrent. There is a kind of an intent and a design to the laws, that, there's laws and agency decisions and other actions that government has taken because they have a larger purpose and an intent. Now, all of this, I deliberately skipped this, all of this works if you see your government as legitimate. a key concept when we're defining government is it has to have the authority. Otherwise, it's a crazy person with a tinfoil hat standing on the corner screaming about, Martians. If you don't have authority, the other parts of the definition don't matter, okay? Authority is an important concept. It's what makes a government legitimate. It's what allows it to pass laws and to make public policy. The authority typically comes from within. If people recognize the government as legitimate, then it will have power to make laws and to pass public policy. Some of the legitimacy also has to come from outside. Governments have to deal with other governments. So, for example, Isabel, you just came back from Israel, and you see that struggle between Israel and Palestine. And Palestine has had trouble historically getting external recognition. Are you in fact a state? Are you in fact, who is the government of Palestine? Who recognizes them? It's hard to be at the bargaining table if other political entities don't recognize you. This is an incredibly important concept. It's also important because I can use it to figure out what it is I'm looking at. Part of the legitimacy of a government is dependent on where does your authority come from. And as I decide or I define where it comes from, I know what I'm looking at. So for example, if the source of authority is from the people have elected governmental officials, I'm looking at a democracy. If the source of authority comes from blood, from a hereditary ruler, I'm looking at what? What system am I looking at where hereditary rulers ruled in?
Dictatorship.
Well, it could be. That's one form of it.
Monarchy.
More specifically, it might be a monarchy. If that person is claiming authority and kind of ruling through power and force because of their blood, I might be looking at a dictatorship. A dictatorship is where authority comes because I took it. I might have manipulated the political system. When you look at the rise of Hitler and Mussolini and other kind of dictators, often they've done some things to manipulate the political system to come in through seemingly legitimate means, but they're, a dictator by definition is using power and force to stay in authority, okay? So, all right, more sophisticated understanding of government, and we'll continue to develop this as the year goes on. Again, the assumption is you come in with this, but if you looked at your definition, did you have this? You might have had some, right? But maybe not all. All right, what does the government, do to make its laws in public policy? Well, it engages the act of governing involves politics. And that's a term you ought to be understanding of. It used to be a relatively kind of benign term, but it's taken on a kind of negative connotation. It's a dirty word now. Oh, that person is political. He's a politician. There's this negative connotation that goes with this word. Because, I don't know, what do you think when you hear the word politics? What do you think of?
Like someone sneaky.
Yeah. Trying to do what?
Trying to trick you into
Getting what they want, right? They're sneaky, they're manipulative, they're trying to get what they want. Because what's been lost in the definition of politics is that word, which I might underline. Part of getting what you want in any kind of, governmental situation, in any social situation, is the art of compromise. I'm going to give, a little bit so I get a little bit of what I want. And what I think you guys have grown up with is an era of more overzealousness when it comes to government. The polarization between kind of the political spectrum, the left and the right. That any compromise is failure. I'm giving something completely unpalatable to the other side and I can't stand it. Really, when you think about politics, yes, there's the struggle, but there's compromise to try to steer laws and public policy. Another kind of more simple definition of politics is who gets what, when, and how. It's kind of a nice, concise definition. All right, so we've defined government. Now we've got to kind of define where and how they operate. There's got to be a kind of a structure from within which they operate, and that's the state. The state is kind of the physical framework where governments operate. What makes a state is, again, kind of subjective. You know, if you go to the State Department, it's kind of funny, our Department of State is actually dealing with foreign policy. Secretary of State is John Kerry, and he's, you know, right now looking at these, you know, the crisis that's kind of, you know, Israel and Syria, and the Ukraine. And, the Department of State puts together a list of countries that the United States recognizes. And in our list, there's 194 states in the world. This one, I think. Yeah. So this is, again, it's a link that you can look at, but this is a list of our states that we recognize. And we list 195, starting with Afghanistan. They go alphabetically here.
Will Eric please come to the main office? Eric, to the main office.
And so in this list, you know, you've got a bunch. Belize, they made that up. Bosnia-Herzegovina, never heard of it. On and on it goes, right? And what's kind of interesting is Gabon. The diversity, I suppose, in this list. I'm kind of, you know, joking and pointing out places that you either know or don't know. There are some obscure places in this list. Hopefully not Bosnia-Herzegovina, but maybe Nauru. You know, what is that? So, you know, this is a kind of a diverse list where some are maybe not places that you recognize. So what makes a state a state? And why did you go to Google? All right, back I go. What makes a state a state? Well, again, we've got a formal definition. In a state, again, we're going to have kind of people to start with. There's a body of people. They live within a defined territory. You know, arbitrary lines drawn on a map. You know, what's interesting is, if you think of like Palestine, to come back to that, you know, they consider themselves a state as in there are people of Palestinian origin all over the place, and they're kind of with us. They don't have to be, in other words, perhaps the territory doesn't have to be contiguous. You don't have to, you know, be all together in the same place. If you think of what started World War I, Serbia wanted to be together with everyone of the Slavic language, you know, anybody with that kind of language origins. And that crossed state kind of, you know, or traditional kind of lines. But I've got a defined kind of, you know, group at least. We'll debate whether or not they can be, you know, in disparate locations. But I've got a group of people living in a defined territory who are organized under a government, which we've defined, with the authority to govern themselves. They don't have to look towards a higher authority. So again, I've got to break these terms down a little bit. What am I talking about when I'm talking about people? When you looked at that list, again, there was a diversity to it. I don't need X amount of people. On that list is the Vatican. Anybody ever been? Anybody been to Rome and visited the Vatican? The Vatican is not only small in terms of population, it's small in terms of size. Their population is under 1,000, but they're still considered a state. We, you know, our U.S. State Department recognizes them. And really it comes back to why? Well, because they're a, you know, a cultural, religious authority that has sway over a large number of people. And for that reason, they're an entity that the United States recognizes and will, you know, engage in diplomatic relations with. You don't have to have, you know, I mentioned before, like Serbia wanting to be with all people of Slavic origin. And I kind of implied from that what makes a state is this homogeneity. But that doesn't have to be the case either. You can have this, you know, amazingly diverse ethnic population and still be a state. If you look at, for example, Myanmar, that's made up of 135 different ethnic groups. There's no homogeneity there. They're incredibly diverse in terms of who they are. So how do I, you know, figure out, you know, what's the composition of people? What makes people people within a state? Really, it comes to citizenship. Citizenship is something that the government confers upon people that unifies them. Because what it does is it gives those people universally certain rights and compels them to certain duties. When you think of citizenship, you ought to think of both. Most